It's reasonable to say that there's been a massive uptick of interest in Barry Harris and his teaching method in the past few years, especially on the internet. And what I'd like to do today is give, from my own experience of going to his workshops over the years, a broad brushstrokes overview of what it's about, how his system works, what it's good for, whether or not it'd be right for you, and things that are a bit tricky about it, the things I would prioritise as a new learner. Towards the end of this video, I'm going to talk about books and video channels that I think are absolutely 100% reliable. Hello, welcome to Jazz Star Scrapbook. Okay, so first of all, who is Barry Harris? He was one of the great jazz pianists of all time. So if you look at his discography, it's just nuts. He played with Sonny Stitt, Coleman Hawkins, Dexter Gordon, Wes Montgomery, Warren Marsh, Lee Konitz, Elvin Jones, the Count Basie Orchestra, you name it, he played with them, right? But if anything, his career as a jazz educator is even more nuts because he was going for probably about 7 decades. While he was still at school, he was teaching people like Paul Chambers, Tommy Flanagan and James Jamerson. And people are probably familiar with his modern day students who are still young. Like many people, I passed through Barry's workshop over the years. I tried to get as many as I could when he was visiting London, but I would say that I got a good general gist of how he was teaching, and I did have some contact with the man himself. Now, Barry's system is all about bebop, and very specifically the stars of his 2 idols, Charlie Parker and Bud Powell. So if you're interested in that stuff, this is it. I mean, maybe if you're more interested in modal improvisation or something, go and do that. You'll probably find not a huge amount for you here. But if you're really interested in learning the bebop language, I'd focus on Barry Harris's system, or at least give it a go, because I think it's one of the best ways to learn. Barry's system is quite tricky at first because it has a lot of unfamiliar terminology. So we call enclosures surrounds. What we would normally call a mixolydian mode is called the dominant scale. What he calls a chord is a 4-note arpeggio, and so on and so forth. That can be a bit confusing at first. I would say what it's really great for is turning scales into music and into convincing idiomatic jazz language. As far as I know, Barry Harris always taught in a 3-part workshop format. You start off with 2 hours of harmony, then you do 2 hours of improvisation, and if your brain hasn't imploded, you do 2 hours of singing. And in a way, I was always a bit sad that I didn't always get to do the singing class, because that's kind of the heart of the class. And it would teach all the instrumentalists to sing a standard, find their key, and really get into the words. That's kind of important and overlooked. And I think in a way, a lot of the most special experiences I had at the workshop was sitting in on the singing workshop and sometimes even singing myself. But I think what most people are familiar with from the Barry Harris teaching legacy is harmony and improvisation. And these are actually separate, which might seem a bit strange for somebody who's used to modern mainstream jazz education. When we talk about improvisation, often we're just talking about harmony, right? So what's the difference? Well, the harmony class was all about chords and what he called movements through chords, what you might even call, forms of counterpoint. The improvisation class, on the other hand, was all about single note bebop lines. So harmony was all about chords, as I said, and actually Barry was very interested in a thing called movements. So he would often quote Coleman Hawkins, who said, "I don't play chords, I play movement." And I think most people are familiar with the Barry Harris scale, the 8-note scale. There's actually 4 of them: major 6th diminished, minor 6th diminished, 7 diminished, 7 flat 5 diminished, of which I think the 2 first ones are the most important to learn right away: major 6th diminished and minor 6th diminished. So these are basically what happens when you take 6th chord. So I'm just going through the inversions of the major 6th chord. So C major 6th. And I put the diminished chords in between. And you get something which is often called mechanical voicings or block chords. You can do it with the minor as well. This is very common in sort of 1940s big band arranging, especially for saxophone soli. And it was brought onto piano, the sort of lock knuckle block chord style. On guitar, probably the equivalent would be Wes Montgomery with his chord soloing, right? So this is not something that Barry invented, but Barry sort of took the scale that comes from this idea, which is an 8-note scale, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, flat 6, 6, 7, 1. So it's like a major scale with an extra half step between 5 and 6. And he would break this down into the major 6th notes, and then diminished notes, and And then, for instance, you can borrow notes from the diminished into the major, and you can borrow notes from the major sixth into the diminished. So he would have an exercise like this in 3 voices. Where we have that moving in a voice, for instance. Or, you know, I love to play this where you've got borrowed major notes into the diminished, for instance. Or you can even do like contrary motion stuff like this. It's very balanced, so it always goes 1-5, 1-5, 1-5, even when you're doing something like that. It wasn't the only thing he taught in the harmony class. He taught loads of really interesting stuff, but it's probably the thing that's best known, and that's where this comes from. And I'd probably start with those, to be fair. Next, we have the single note workshop. So this is something that I probably learnt the most from. And in this class, Barry Harris would basically dictate lines for you to play. So even though it's called the improvisation class, there wasn't much improvisation in it. Instead, Barry would be teaching you these awesome bebop lines through a standard, and then the whole class would play it back at speed, and then you'd have to hang on.
Play it. 1, 2, 3, hey. Okay, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, hey. One more time. You better be patting your foot. You aren't patting your foot. Pat your foot and feel it. Play it one more time. Do it once again.
So it's great for the ears, great for the technique, and a bit of a roast, to be honest with you. There was something very special about sitting over from Barry and hearing him come up with this stuff in real time. And I think part of the teaching that might be a bit lost is the fact that Barry was able to just pull amazing lines out and then explain how he constructed them in class. There's a whole load of stuff which you wouldn't just get from just the notes and the theory on its own. As far as the method goes, it's really again about scales, but this time like 7-note scales often. There's a bit of overlap with the harmony class, obviously, but a lot of the time we're dealing with more traditional scales. And one of the things that I learned is that you learn to block down chord progression. So for instance, rhythm changes becomes 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, 4, 1, 5. And then you run the scales as a basic exercise from up to the 7th or up to the 7th and down again. And what this does is it puts all of the chord tones on the beat. So it really strongly outlines the chords.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
And although it sounds a bit boring and simple on its own, I can't actually recommend a better way to learn the changes of a tune than just doing this in every position. So the second thing, which I use all the time, is let the dominant dominate. So we can turn a lot of these basic chords that we have into dominant chords and not worry too much about like the tonic, major and minor, maybe just play a couple of notes from them. So for instance, obviously we have the dominant 7th, can be a dominant 7th. We also have the altered chord, which can be replaced by the tritone substitution. And actually, all dominants can be made altered anyway.
Because jazz.
And then we have a relationship with the half diminished chord. For C7, that relates to E7 flat 5, E half diminished. And then you have a relationship with the 2 chord. So in fact, actually, if you've got a 2-5-1, for instance, G minor 7, C7, the dominant scale, which is to say the Mixolydian scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, can be used over the whole thing because that scale contains all of the G minor stuff as well. Okay, so it's a very blocked approach to improvisation. Why the dominant? Well, we can spend a lot of time just learning stuff on the dominant. You've got your basic scale. You've got your thirds. You've got your triads. You've got your chords, which are 4-note arpeggios. That's 7th chords. Yeah. Lower neighbour tones, which you can add to the intervals, for instance. Yeah, and you've got you can add them to the bottom of chords as well. They sound great. Other things we can do, added note scales, of course. So not only can we add one note, like a bebop scale, like this, we can add, in that case, 3 extra notes. You can even add all the notes of the chromatic scale to a dominant scale. How cool is that? Pivots. There's the 5-4-3-2 endings. These are all great little things that you can incorporate into your lines, and then when you start to combine them, you know, it leads very naturally to music from basic scales. Aside from these vanilla options, one thing that kind of blew jazz harmony wide open for me, and one of my best doing videos is about this, is the brothers and sisters concept. So with the C7, you've got the tritone, obviously, which is G flat 7 in this case, but you also have 2 other chords which you can use as well, which come from the diminished chord. So you've got C7, E flat 7, going on minor thirds each time, and then also F sharp 7. And of those, I think the E flat 7 and the G flat 7 are the most widely used. So if I'm going from C7 to F major, for instance, I can also go using E flat 7 to F, or I could go G flat 7 to F. Yeah. This really blows open the whole thing. And anything that you can do to those dominant chords, you can do to any other chord that you substituted with a dominant. The possibilities are just endless. But that focus on dominant scale activity is really good, because actually it's 85% of basically what I do, for what it's worth. And then when you've done that, you can start to think about the minor, which can be, you know, melodic minor, harmonic minor, minor 6 diminished, and do the same stuff and make lines out of that. And the minor is really applicable. You can also, of course, use the major, but with those basically 3 or 4 scales, you've got everything pegged. Absolutely number one, I'd say get the Howard Rees DVD set. It's got Barry teaching on it. That's really important, and it's the nearest thing you can get now to actually studying with the man himself. Set 1 is enough for about a year, maybe several years of diligent study, depending on how fast you learn. I learn quite slowly, and it's expensive, but I think it's just the best thing you can get, really. Obviously, there's also some workshop videos on YouTube that loads of people have looked at, but the Howard Rees DVD set has the advantage of being organised and prioritised in the way that I've talked about. In terms of books, I would recommend the late friend of mine, Alan Kingston, his book, Barry Harris Method for Guitar, I think it's called. That covers all the chord and movement stuff. I would also recommend, for the single note stuff, Ronnie Ben-Hur's Talk Jazz, which I think comes in both the standard version and the guitar version, so I definitely get that as well. In terms of channels, I don't want to... If I'm missing people out, it's not because I don't think they're reliable. It's just that I know these people know what they're talking about, right? So I can absolutely recommend them. And that is Chris Parks, which I think a lot of you will know anyway. His channel, Things I Learned from Barry Harris, very complete. He also teaches on Open Studio. If you join Open Studio's workshops, I think he teaches on those. Thomas Eccles, I think it is, his channel, Labyrinth of Limitations. It goes really deep into the harmony stuff mostly, at least from what I've seen. He's really he's sort of invented his own concepts that take what I know from Barry and kind of move them on a little bit. So he's definitely worth checking out. I would also recommend Isaac Raz. He's a pianist. And lastly, I'd recommend Sean Verma's channel. He's a very reliable source of information, and his channel is called Jazz Skills. If you don't know those channels already, add those to your subscriptions. Those are reliable sources of information. As I say, they're not the only reliable sources of information, but these are people I know who have had direct and heavy contact with Barry himself, and frankly are much more qualified to talk about his stuff than I am. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope that was helpful. Leave any comments or questions below. See you on the next one.